The call came at 6:47 on a Thursday morning, which was the first sign something was wrong. Carol Harmon didn't get calls before 8. She was a project manager at an architecture firm in Denver, and the people in her life had learned over decades that Carol ran on a schedule. Calls before 8 meant emergencies. Calls before 8 meant the world had stepped outside its lane. She was in her kitchen when her phone buzzed against the granite countertop. Still in her robe, coffee not yet poured, the screen showed a number she didn't recognize, a 406 area code. Montana. She picked it up on the second ring. Ms. Harmon, this is Darlene Sykes. I live about 2 miles east of your daddy's place on Route 9. Carol set down her coffee mug. She knew the name vaguely. A woman with a horse trailer, a blue mailbox. She hadn't been to Billings in 8 months. Is he all right? Oh, he's fine, Darlene said quickly. He's fine. But I thought you should know. There are motorcycles out there, a lot of them. Men in leather vests. They've been coming every Saturday for 3 weeks now and, well, I don't know who else to call. I tried the sheriff's office, but Deputy Larson said there wasn't anything they could do unless your father filed a complaint, and your father won't file anything. You know how he is, and I just thought someone in the family ought to know that there are what look like gang members working on his property. Carol stood very still. Through her kitchen window, the Denver skyline was just beginning to catch the early light. A plane crossed the sky in silence. How many? Last Saturday I counted 22 motorcycles from my porch. 22. Yes, ma'am. And my father, he's letting them. Darlene's voice carried something complicated. Honey, he's been cooking breakfast for them. Carol drove up the same day. She didn't plan to. She had a 9 o'clock meeting about a mixed-use development in Cherry Creek and a 12:30 with a contractor who was already 3 weeks behind, and a 4 o'clock she'd been rescheduling for 2 months. She rescheduled all of it. She threw clothes into a bag without thinking about what she was throwing. She texted her assistant, family emergency, working remote. She backed her car out of the garage and pointed it north on I-25 and drove. It was 8 hours from Denver to Billings if you pushed it. 8 hours of high plains and then the land beginning to fold and rise, the mountains showing up on the western horizon like an announcement. Carol had made this drive so many times in her life that she could do it without thinking. That was the problem. She could do it without thinking, and so she had been doing exactly that. Going 8 months without going home, telling herself he was fine because he said he was fine. Because Walter Harmon said he was fine, the way a dam says the water pressure is manageable right up until the moment it doesn't. She thought about the last time she'd seen him. Thanksgiving. She and her husband Greg had driven up with a turkey breast and a bag of groceries. Her father had met them at the door in his work clothes because Walter Harmon did not change out of his work clothes for Thanksgiving or for any other occasion. He'd been polite and stiff and had eaten carefully and asked Greg about his business and answered Carol's questions in complete sentences that revealed nothing. He'd walked them to the car at 8 in the evening and shook Greg's hand and patted Carol's arm once and said, "Drive safe." That was how you knew he loved you. He patted your arm once. If he patted twice, you'd done something extraordinary. She passed through Casper and kept going. The radio played country music, and then static, and then more country music. She thought about her mother. Margaret Harmon had been a woman of enormous warmth contained in a small body. 5'2" gray hair cut short and practical hands that were always either working or reaching toward someone. She'd had a laugh that was too big for her frame and a stubbornness that was, Carol understood now, the original source of everything stubborn in the Harmon bloodline. Margaret had held the farm together in every way that didn't involve physical labor. She'd kept the books handled, the loans managed, the relationships with feed suppliers and equipment dealers in the 3 part-time hands who'd worked the property during the cattle years. She'd also baked pies and sung hymns off-key and raised 2 children on that land and loved Walter Harmon with a consistency that made it look easy, even though Carol was old enough now to understand it wasn't. Margaret died in September 2019 of pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in July, gone by September. Those 8 weeks were the fastest and slowest of Carol's life. She'd taken leave from work and moved into her childhood bedroom and watched her mother shrink and her father stand very straight beside the bed every single day, holding Margaret's hand, not speaking much, just being there the way a wall is there, fixed, certain, refusing to move. At the funeral, Walter had worn his good suit, the one he kept in the back of the closet for weddings and funerals, and he had stood at the graveside with his hat in his hands and his face set like concrete, and he had not cried. Not a single tear, not in front of anyone. Carol had cried enough for both of them. After the funeral, she'd stayed another 2 weeks. She'd cleaned the house and filled in the freezer and gone over the farm finances with her father at the kitchen table, and that was when she'd first understood how bad things were. The cattle operation had been winding down for years. Walter had sold the herd, slowly 20 head. 1 year, 15 the next, until there was nothing left but the land and a barn full of equipment that was slowly rusting into the ground. The farm income was essentially zero. They were living on Social Security and a small pension from the county co-op and whatever was left of savings that had been depleted by Margaret's medical bills. She'd asked her father directly, "Dad, how are you going to manage this?" He'd said, "I'll manage." She'd pushed, "There are programs, there are resources. You could apply for a farm assistance loan. There's a state program for elderly farmers that I'll manage, Carol." And he had looked at her with those eyes, the gray-green eyes that were identical to her own, and she had understood that the conversation was over, that it had been over before it started. Because Walter Harmon had been managing things on his own since 1973, when his own father died and left him the farm at 38 years old, and the idea that he would stop managing that, he would ask for help, that he would accept the framing of himself as someone who needed assistance, was as foreign to him as speaking a language he'd never heard. She'd gone back to Denver. She called every Sunday. The calls lasted 11 minutes on average. He was fine. The chickens were fine. A post down on the north fence, but he'd get to it. The tractor still wasn't running, but he had the part on order. He was fine. She had believed him because it was easier to believe him. She crossed into Montana just after 3 in the afternoon. The mountains were closer now, the sky a deep blue that only happens at altitude, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with this particular stretch of highway. Not dread exactly, not grief exactly. Something that lived between the two. The feeling of approaching a place that held too much of your life in it. A place where every corner had a memory attached, and the memories were beautiful and heavy at the same time. Her brother Danny had loved Montana with the specific intensity of a person who knew they were going to leave it. He'd known from age 12 that he was going to join the Army. He'd announced it at dinner one night, and Walter had said, "Pass the salt," and Margaret had set down her fork and stared at the wall for 30 seconds, and then picked it up again, and nobody said anything more about it until Danny was 17 and started bringing home the recruitment brochures. He'd joined at 18, did 3 tours, Afghanistan first in 2003, and then again in 2006 and 2008. He called home every 2 weeks from wherever he was, and those calls were the high points of Margaret's life during those years. Carol could remember her mother's face when Danny called. The way she lit up, the way she laughed too loud at things that probably weren't that funny, because the relief of hearing his voice made everything funnier. Danny was killed in Kannar Province in October 2009. An IED. He was 25 years old. The Army sent a chaplain and a casualty notification officer. They came to the farm in dress uniforms on a Tuesday morning. Walter had been in the barn. He'd walked out and seen them coming, and he'd stopped in the middle of the driveway and stood very still for what Carol was told was almost a full minute before he walked toward them. Carol had been in Denver. She'd gotten a different kind of call. She'd driven up. The farm felt like it was made of glass for weeks after. Everything fragile, everything breakable. Walter had moved through it like a man who'd decided the only way to survive was to keep moving, so he moved. He woke up at 4:45. He fed the animals. He fixed what needed fixing. He did not stop long enough to shatter. Margaret had grieved openly, the way women are sometimes permitted to, and men are not, and it had taken years, but she had found her way back to herself. Walter had grieved differently, quietly, in a way that was invisible from the outside, but was, Carol understood now, continuous, unending, a low-grade fever that never broke. She took the exit off E90 toward Route 9 just before 4 o'clock, and the land opened up around her, big and flat and golden. In the late afternoon light, the kind of landscape that makes you understand why people either love Montana or can't wait to leave it. There is no middle ground here. The sky is too large. The land is too unforgiving. You either belong to it or you don't. Carol had spent 30 years trying to figure out which one she was. She turned onto the county road and the farmhouse came into view a quarter-mile ahead, and she pressed the brake without meaning to because the sight of it stopped her cold. The fence was new. The entire north fence line, which she had last seen sagging into the dirt with rotted posts, was standing straight and clean, new wood bright against the old grass. The mailbox at the end of the driveway had been replaced. The porch, and this was what caught her breath. The porch had been repainted. The peeling gray-white she'd watched deteriorate for years was gone. Fresh white. Clean lines. She sat in her car on the county road for a full 30 seconds. Then she put it back in drive and pulled into the driveway. Walter was on the porch. Of course he was. 70 years of farming had set his internal clock to a frequency that never changed. And late afternoon meant porch time, coffee in hand, watching the light change over the property, the way a man watches something he loves and is afraid of losing. He stood when he saw her car. Even at 90, he stood when someone arrived. Manners were non-negotiable. Carol got out of the car. She looked at her father. He was thinner than she remembered. His face was more deeply lined, the skin loose at his jaw and neck, the curve of his back more pronounced than it had been at Thanksgiving. But he was standing straight enough. His eyes were clear. He was wearing his work clothes. He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts pleasure and suspicion, which was as close to pure happiness as Walter Harmon ever got. "What are you doing here?" he asked. It wasn't unfriendly. It was just Walter. "A woman named Darlene Sykes called me." His mouth pressed into a flat line. Of course she did. Carol came up the porch steps and stopped in front of him. She looked at him for a long moment, at the lines on his face and the steadiness of his eyes, and the hands that held the coffee mug with a slight tremor she didn't remember being this pronounced in November. She said, "I want you to tell me what's going on." He said, "Come inside. I'll put the coffee on." The kitchen was exactly as she remembered it, which was itself a kind of grief. The same curtains her mother had hung, the same calendar on the wall, though it was 3 years out of date and had never been changed, because changing it meant acknowledging the years that had passed without the person who used to change it. The same table with the same 4 chairs, one of which had not been pushed back in since Margaret sat in it last. Walter poured coffee with both hands, wrapped around the pot for stability, and Carol watched him do it and said nothing. He set a mug in front of her and sat down in his chair, the one closest to the window, and looked at her the way he always had, directly, without apology or softness. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to let me tell it through before you start in." She held her mug. She waited. He opened the drawer next to the stove. He reached in past a tangle of rubber bands and batteries and old pens and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He set it on the table between them. Carol opened it, read it again. A foreclosure notice, $68,000, filed in February. It was now the first week of April. "Dad, I was going to handle it." How were you going to handle $68,000? He looked at his coffee. "I haven't figured that part out yet." "You've known since February and you didn't tell me." "You would have worried. I am your daughter. Worrying about you is not a malfunction. It is a function. That is what I am here for." He nodded once. He didn't argue, which was new, which was different enough from every prior version of this conversation that Carol stopped and looked at him more carefully. Something had changed. She could feel it the way you can feel a room where furniture has been moved, even if you can't immediately identify what's different. Something in him had shifted some degree of the iron, and she didn't understand it yet. She said, "Tell me about the motorcycles." He took a long sip of his coffee, set it down, looked at the window. And then Walter Harmon, a man who could go 11 minutes on a Sunday phone call without volunteering a single unsolicited fact about himself, opened his mouth and started at the beginning. It was a Tuesday night 3 weeks ago. He hadn't been sleeping well, which he said, the way other people say, they hadn't been sleeping at all, minimized, compressed into the most manageable version. He'd gotten up at 2 in the morning and gone to the kitchen for water and heard something from the direction of the barn. Not an alarm. Not a crash, just sound, the kind of sound that doesn't belong at 2 in the morning. He'd pulled on his coat and boots, which Carol noticed he described in detail, and she understood that for her father the deliberateness of those actions was important. He had not panicked. He had dressed appropriately and gone to investigate. The barn door was ajar. He'd pushed it open with his shoulder and switched on the overhead light and found 6 men asleep in his hay. 6 of them. Big men, leather vests with patches, motorcycles lined up just inside the barn door out of the rain. One of them had a beard that went to his chest. Another had tattoos covering every visible inch of his forearms. They'd arranged themselves in the hay with a kind of unconscious order boots together, jackets folded, like men who'd spent enough time in rough conditions that they knew how to make a temporary shelter function. They woke up when the light came on. There was a moment of pure stillness, the kind that happens when a situation hasn't yet decided what it's going to be. Walter looked at them. They looked at Walter. He told Carol, "I thought about calling the sheriff. And then I thought they didn't break anything. They didn't touch anything. They just needed a dry place out of the rain." So he went back to the house and started cracking eggs. He made 6 plates, scrambled eggs, bacon, biscuits from a mix he kept in the cabinet, black coffee. He carried it to the porch and went back to the barn door and said, "Breakfast is on the porch if you want it." They came. They sat on the porch steps, in the railing, in the single chair, and ate in complete silence while his 6 chickens walked between their boots, investigating with the fearless curiosity of chickens. When they were done, the big one with the beard said much obliged, and they went back to the barn and rolled their bikes out one by one and left. That was it. That was the whole story as Walter had understood it then. Carol listened to all of this. She said, and they came back. He said the following Saturday, he told her about the fence, how they'd pulled into the driveway with a pickup truck full of fresh posts and wire and tools, without asking, without explaining. How he'd come out in a temper and told them he didn't need charity and he didn't need anyone feeling sorry for him. And the big one had looked at him and turned back to his work without a word. And Walter had stood in his own yard with his mouth open and then turned around and gone inside. And here, for the first time in the telling, something crossed Walter's face that wasn't quite the story. A small thing, a flicker, like a man who'd thought he was done being surprised by his own reactions and had discovered he wasn't. He said, "I pulled out your mother's skillet." Carol went still. "That big cast iron one, 12-inch, he paused. "I don't know why. It just felt right, like I was supposed to cook something." She looked at her father's face. He was looking at the table. That skillet had been on a high shelf for 2 years. Carol knew because she tried to take it down at Thanksgiving to use it for the turkey, and Walter had said quietly but with a finality that closed the subject entirely, "Leave that one up there." The skillet had been Margaret's. It was the one she'd used for Sunday breakfast when Carol and Danny were small, when the mornings were long and easy, and the farm was full and nobody had yet learned what was coming. It was the one she'd seasoned every few months with a thin coat of oil, the one Carol had watched her dry over the stove burner with practiced efficiency. The one that was in whatever way objects accumulate, meaning the physical center of everything that had been good about that kitchen. He said, "I made lunch for 6 men I'd never met, and they ate it, and they fixed my fence, and they left, and the fence was better than it had been in 15 years. Carol looked out the window at the north fence line, straight and solid in the late afternoon light. Then the next Saturday, 14 men in the roof. He told her about the roof, how they'd arrived at 8 in the morning with materials and tools and climbed up there and worked for 9 hours straight and came down at the end of the day for the lunch he'd made them and left when the light was going. How the sound of their boots on the roof had filled the house all day, and he'd sat in the kitchen with his cat and listened to it and felt in a way he couldn't entirely explain, like the house was being held rather than worked on. Like something was being restored that wasn't just shingles. Carol said, "When was this?" "Which Saturday 2 weeks ago?" "And then this past Saturday?" 22. He said they planted the north field. She didn't say anything. He said all 40 acres. They brought seed and tillers and worked until dark. I made dinner for 20 people. Used every pot in the house. Carol looked at her coffee. She picked it up, set it down without drinking. She said, "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." He waited. "Are you all right?" "Not fine. Not managing. Are you actually all right?" He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the light was changing, going golden and long, the way it does in Montana in early spring, and the chickens were making their evening sounds in the yard, and the property looked different from how it had looked in November, and different from how Carol had been picturing it in her head over 8 months of 11-minute Sunday calls. He said, "I'm better than I was." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I mean I've been worse and I didn't tell you, and I should have." He looked at his hands. I should have told you things were bad. I kept waiting for it to get better on its own, and it didn't. This was more honesty than Walter Harmon had delivered in a single sitting in longer than Carol could remember. It sat between them on the table like something fragile, and neither of them moved toward it or away from it. She said very quietly, "How long has it been this bad?" He looked at the table. "Since about 6 months after your mother died." She felt something crack open in the center of her chest. Not break, crack. The way a bone cracks under pressure, still holding, but changed. She said, "Dad, I didn't want you to worry. You said that already." "I know." He looked at his hands. "She'd have scolded me for it. She always said I was too proud." He almost smiled at that almost, and the nearness of it hurt Carol more than the absence. She'd have been right. She usually was. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. Then Carol said, "I want to meet them." He looked up. "The men who've been coming here. I want to meet them Saturday," Walter said. "Come back Saturday." She didn't go back to Denver. She drove to a motel in Billings, a clean one near the highway, and she checked in and sat on the edge of the bed in her road clothes and stared at nothing for about 10 minutes. Then she opened her laptop and started working because Carol Harmon, like her father, dealt with difficult emotions by being productive. And it was genetic, and she knew it was genetic, and that knowledge had never once stopped her from doing it. She thought about Danny. This was not unusual. She thought about Danny often in the way you think about someone whose absence has become a permanent fixture of your interior landscape. Not with the sharp grief of the early years, which had been almost physically painful, a missing limb made of memory. More like a background frequency. Always there. Sometimes louder. The particular note that played beneath everything else. She thought about what her father had said, that he'd been worse and hadn't told her. She thought about the foreclosure notice folded in the junk drawer next to her mother's reading glasses. She thought about the skillet on the high shelf and what it meant that Walter Harmon had finally taken it down. She called Greg that night. He listened carefully, the way Greg always listened, without interrupting. "I think I'm going to be here for a few days," she said. He said, "Do what you need to do." She said, "I don't know what I need to do yet." He said, "That's okay. Figure it out. I'll manage here." She fell asleep with the TV on, which was something she never did at home, and she dreamed of Montana in August, the way the land looked from the top of the ridge above the North Field, when she was 10 years old, and Danny was 7, and they used to climb up there in the evenings to watch the sunset and eat whatever they'd pocketed from the dinner table. The way the sky went from blue to orange to purple in about 20 minutes, and the whole valley turned gold below them, and Danny said once, with the absolute authority of a 7-year-old, that this was the best place in the world. He said it like it was a fact he'd verified. She believed him. Saturday morning, 6 o'clock. Carol was parked on the county road across from the farm in the gray pre-dawn light with a coffee from a gas station that was better than it had any right to be, and she was waiting. She heard them before she saw them. The sound of engines rolling down Route 9, slow and steady, 22 motorcycles in a loose formation, the sound building, and then the bikes appearing around the bend in the road headlights in the early gray light. They turned into the driveway one by one, parking in 2 rows along the gravel, the way they apparently always did, and the sound of the engines died one at a time until there was just the morning birds and the quiet. Carol watched from her car. She watched the men climb off their bikes. They were of various ages, various sizes, the common denominator, the leather vests with patches, and the unhurried ease of people who had a task in front of them and knew exactly what they were going to do. A few women too, she noted. 3, maybe 4. Walter came out of the house at 7:15. He was in his work clothes, coffee in hand, and he stood on the porch and looked at the assembled group, the way a general regards his troops, except this general hadn't ordered these troops and wasn't entirely sure why they kept showing up, but had stopped arguing about it. One man walked toward the porch, tall, gray-haired 60s with a face that had seen considerable weather. He walked the way certain men walk when they have decided that nothing is worth rushing. Carol got out of her car. The man on the porch, she assumed this was Duke, the chapter president Walter had mentioned, stopped when he saw her coming up the driveway. He looked at her steadily, not unfriendly, just assessing. Walter looked down from the porch at Carol, then at Duke, then at Carol again. "Duke," he said, "this is my daughter, Carol." Duke looked at her for a moment, then he nodded once, the nod of a man acknowledging a fact. "Ma'am." Carol stopped at the foot of the porch steps. She looked at Duke. She looked at her father. She said, "I'll put the coffee on." in the kitchen making coffee for 23 people with whatever she could find in the cabinets. Walter owned exactly one large percolator and two regular pots, which was not enough but would have to do. Carol thought about the foreclosure notice and the north fence and the roof and the 40 acres of planted field and the 83,000 things that could be said about the situation she was standing in the middle of, and then she just made the coffee. Duke came to the back door while the others were moving past the house toward the north field. He knocked, which surprised her. Walter, she thought, probably hadn't expected knocking either. She opened the door. He was holding his hat in his hand. She wasn't sure why that surprised her, maybe because she'd assumed men like this didn't take their hats off, which told her something about the assumptions she'd been walking around with. She let him in. Walter was at the table with his coffee and his cat on his lap, and when Duke came in, he looked up and the two of them exchanged a look that Carol couldn't entirely read, but recognized as the look of two men who have been through something together and are still figuring out what to call it. Duke sat down. He did not accept coffee when she offered it, just shook his head once. He said to Walter, "I got something to tell you." "I probably should have said before now." Walter said, "All right." Duke said, "3 weeks ago when we rode in out of the rain. That wasn't the first time I've been to this property." Walter's expression didn't change. He waited. Duke said, "My brother Garrett served with your son in Cunard, 2009. The kitchen was very quiet. Duke said Garrett didn't come home either." Walter's hands on his coffee mug went still. He looked at Duke for a long time. The cat shifted on his lap and resettled. Outside, the sound of the bikers beginning work in the north field carried faintly through the window. Duke said, "I knew about this farm. Garrett mentioned it in his letters. Said Danny Harmon used to talk about it. About the land, the cattle, the big sky. Said it sounded like a place a man could breathe. He said it like he was homesick for a place he'd never been." Carol was standing against the kitchen counter. She was holding a dish towel and she didn't realize she'd picked it up. Duke said, "After Garrett died, I looked up Danny Harmon's family, found the address of the farm. I drove past it once, maybe 2 years later, just to see it. I wasn't going to stop. I didn't stop. I just drove past and kept going because I didn't know what I would have said." He was quiet for a moment. Duke said, 3 weeks ago when the rain came and we were on that stretch of Route 9 and Eddie noticed the barn, I recognized the driveway. I didn't say anything to the others. I just thought we need a dry place for the night, and I knew there was a barn here. That part was practical." He looked at his hands, big hands scarred across the knuckles, the hands of a man who had spent decades doing hard things. He said, "But I want you to know that when you came out of that barn in the dark and decided to make us breakfast, instead of anything else, that wasn't something I expected. And what happened after?" He paused. "I can't say exactly why we came back. I can only tell you that when a man that old living alone like that decides to feed you instead of fear you, it does something to a group of men. It makes them want to be worth the meal." Walter said nothing for a long time. His hand moved slowly over the cat's back. Outside, the birds sang and the field workers moved in the distance, and the spring light fell through the kitchen window the way it always had, the same angle, the same quality of light that had fallen in this kitchen for 100 years. Then Walter said quietly, "Garrett, what was he like?" And Duke told him. Carol moved to the chair across the table and sat down without saying a word. She listened to Duke talk about his brother the way you listen to someone describe something irreplaceable, with all of her attention, with everything she had. She thought about Danny. She thought about the way Danny used to eat his eggs at this same table, shoveling them in too fast the way teenage boys eat, while Margaret scolded him about chewing and Walter pretended to read the paper. She thought about the last time she'd sat in this kitchen with Danny the Christmas before his final deployment, and how he'd sat right there in that chair and talked about the mountains around Cunard province with a kind of reluctant wonder. How he'd said the country was beautiful in a way that made you angry because beautiful things weren't supposed to be dangerous. She thought about the folded paper in the drawer, about her father living inside that secret for 2 months, about the skillet on the high shelf finally brought down. She sat in her childhood kitchen and listened to two men talk about two brothers who hadn't come home, and outside the engines had gone quiet, and the only sound was work, steady and rhythmic, the sound of people doing something that needed doing. When Duke finally stood to go, he said to Carol, "Your father's a good man." She said, "I know." Duke said he wouldn't let us help him at first. He wanted to throw us off the property. She almost smiled. That sounds about right. Duke put his hat back on. He said he reminded me of my dad, stubborn in the exact same way, like they both got the manual and memorized the same wrong page. Walter from the table without looking up, I can hear you. Duke said, good. Then he walked out the back door. Carol looked at her father. He was looking at his coffee. His hands were trembling slightly against the mug. The cat purred on his lap. The kitchen was full of morning light. She said, Dad, I have to ask you something. He looked up. She said, Danny's watch, the one they sent back with his things. Do you still have it? Very long pause. Walter said, upstairs. She said, can I see it? He looked at her, the gray-green eyes so much like hers, and in them something she hadn't seen in years. Not quite openness, more like the approach of openness, the threshold of it. A door that had been closed a long time cracked just slightly by the weight of the morning. He said, after we feed everybody. She nodded, after. She went to the stove and picked up her mother's cast iron skillet and felt the weight of it seasoned and certain warm from a burner that had been cold for too long. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at the eggs on the counter and the bacon in the refrigerator and the flour in the cabinet. She said, how many eggs do you have? Walter said, enough. She cracked the first one into the pan, and the sound it made against the hot iron was exactly the sound she remembered from every Saturday morning of her childhood, and the smell of it followed immediately, and she stood at her mother's stove in her father's kitchen on a Saturday morning in April, and she cooked. Walter didn't move from his chair. He watched her the way he'd always watched the women in his family cook, with a particular quality of stillness. Not passive, not idle, but the stillness of a man paying complete attention to something he valued. The cat kernel shifted and settled, and the percolator began its rhythm on the back burner, and outside the sounds of the Northfield work came in waves, voices, the distant mechanical sound of the tiller boots on packed earth. Carol worked without speaking. She found the plates in the same cabinet they had always been in. She found the salt and pepper, where they'd always lived next to the stovetop. She found a wooden spoon her mother had used for 30 years, the handle worn smooth in exactly the place Margaret's grip had been, and when she wrapped her hand around it, it fit her own hand so precisely that she had to stop for a moment and look at nothing. She said without turning around, how long were you not eating properly? From the table, Walter. I eat. She turned to look at him. He held her gaze. There was something in his face that was not quite sheepishness, because Walter didn't do sheepish, but was adjacent to it, in the same neighborhood. She said, I found 3 cans of soup and some crackers in the cabinet, Dad, and eggs and flour. He said, I've been eating. She said, what? Pause. He said, oatmeal, bustust, eggs. I don't need much. She turned back to the eggs. She pushed them in the pan with the worn spoon. She said, when Darlene Sykes called me, she said, you'd been cooking for 20 people. He said, that's different. She said, how is that different? He thought about it for about 3 seconds, which was longer than Walter Harmon usually took to form a response. He said, cooking for yourself is a task. Cooking for other people is a reason. She absorbed that. She didn't know what to do with it exactly. She set it aside and kept working. By 8 o'clock, she had plates laid out on every flat surface available. The kitchen table, the porch railing, the tailgate of a pickup truck that belonged to one of the bikers. 23 breakfasts, which had required 3 pots, both baking sheets, the large cast iron, and the small one she'd found hanging on a hook near the back door, and every last egg in the house. She'd found a tin of coffee in the back of the cabinet that was older than she would have liked, but still smelled like coffee, and the percolator had been going for an hour. The men and women came in from the field in small groups, faces, dusty, hands dirty. They came to the porch the way people come to a table they have been invited to, without ceremony, without fuss, picking up plates and finding somewhere to sit. The porch, the steps, the yard, leaning against the fence that was no longer falling down. Carol stood in the kitchen doorway and watched. She was trying to reconcile the image in front of her with the phone call she'd gotten 4 days ago. The image Darlene Sykes had painted gang members dangerous, and this reality, 20-some people eating eggs on her father's porch in the morning sun, a few of them talking quietly. Most of them simply eating the way people eat when they've been working hard and the food is good, and there's nowhere to be but here. A young man, maybe late 20s, sat on the porch railing near the door. He had an open face more boyish than the other's hair that could have used a cut, and a jacket that was a little too big for his frame, like it had belonged to someone else first. He was eating with the focused appreciation of someone who didn't take meals for granted, not wolfing it down, just paying attention to it. Carol said, "I'm Carol, Walter's daughter." He looked up, said Roach. She waited. He seemed to understand she was waiting for more. He said, "Real name's Eddie, Eddie Marsh. The other guys started calling me Roach years back because I can sleep anywhere." He gestured toward the barn. "Case in point." She said, "How long have you been riding with?" He said, "5 years." He took another forkful. "This is really good, ma'am." She said, "Thank you." He said, "I'm not just saying it. The eggs. Your dad's been cooking for us for 3 weeks and he's good. But these," he paused, holding the fork, "these taste like something specific, like somebody's kitchen, not just food." She looked at him. He was looking at the plate with an expression of genuine recognition, the way you look at a smell that brings back a place. She said, "My mother used to make breakfast like this on Saturday mornings." He looked up at her. His eyes were an ordinary brown. Nothing remarkable, but there was something in them that was paying more attention than young men usually paid. He said, "My mom wasn't around much when I was a kid." He said it simply, without self-pity, the way you state a weather fact. "I spent some time without a place to sleep when I was about 22. He paused. "This is going to sound strange." She said, "Go ahead." He said, "I was passing through Billings. Broke down, actually different bike, worse shape than the one I've got now. I had $20. It was February. A woman found me sitting outside a diner. She brought me in and bought me breakfast and let me use her phone and called someone she knew who could fix the bike." Carol went very still. He said, "I never knew her name. She didn't offer it and I didn't ask. I was 22 and embarrassed and not very good at accepting help." He looked at his plate. She just said, "Everybody needs a warm meal sometimes." Carol said very carefully, "What did she look like?" He described her. Small, gray-haired, cut short, a red coat, laugh lines, the way she'd fussed at him to eat faster because it was getting cold. Carol turned and looked through the screen door at her father. Walter was still at the kitchen table. He was looking at his hands. The cat had moved to the windowsill. The morning light came through the window and fell across the table the way it always had. The same angle, the same quality, and in it, Walter Harmon looked like what he was, a very old man who had outlasted almost everyone who knew him as young. Carol stepped back inside. She went to the table and sat down across from her father. She said, "Dad." He looked up. She said, "Eddie Marsh, the young one, Roach. He was in Billings 5 years ago." February. A woman bought him breakfast and called someone to fix his bike. Walter looked at her for a long time. She said, "That was Mom, wasn't it?" He was quiet. She said, "Dad." He said finally, "She didn't tell me his name. She just said she'd found a young man in trouble and helped him out. You know how she was. She would have found it strange to mention it. It wasn't a production to her. It was just what you did." Carol stared at her father. The enormity of it moved through her slowly, the way large things move. Margaret, in her red coat at a diner counter in Billings, finding a 22-year-old who'd come unstuck from his life, buying him eggs and making a phone call. Dying 6 months later, without knowing what that small act had set in motion. Without knowing that 5 years on the young man she'd helped would show up at her husband's farm as part of a group that was impossibly saving it. The world was not supposed to be this precise. The world was not supposed to close circles this exactly. And yet, she said, "He doesn't know." Walter, "No." She said, "Are you going to tell him?" Very long pause. Walter looked at the window, at the north field where the work was continuing, and the morning was brightening, and the young man on the porch railing was finishing his eggs and looking at the mountains. Walter said, "I don't know yet." Carol sat back. She thought about her mother, about the red coat, about the laugh that was too big for her frame. She thought about what it meant that Margaret Harmon, who had never taken any action she considered remarkable, who had simply moved through her life looking for the small, useful things she could do, had left a thread in the world that was still pulling things together 3 years after she died. See, Walter, things grow back. Carol didn't say anything for a while. Then she got up and refilled her father's coffee, doing it carefully because the pot was heavy and his hands were shaking. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a proud man is make sure the task is already done before he has to ask. She set it down in front of him. She sat back in her chair. Outside, the fieldwork continued. The sun climbed. The chickens investigated the boots of people who were no longer afraid of them. The north field, dark and planted, waited for what was coming. And Carol Harmon, who had driven 8 hours in a panic based on a phone call from a neighbor who had arrived expecting damage and found something she hadn't expected and couldn't yet name, sat at her parents' kitchen table and looked at her father's face and understood that she was going to be here for more than a few days. She was going to be here until whatever this was finished itself. She didn't know what that meant or how long it would take. She only knew that some things, once you've seen them starting, you don't walk away from. Her father looked at her across the table and something moved between them. An acknowledgement or recognition. The particular understanding that passes between two people who have been circling each other with great care for a long time and have finally unexpectedly come close enough to actually see each other. He said, "There's a room made up." She said, "I know." He said, "Your mother kept it that way." "Ready?" She said, "I know, Dad." He looked at his coffee. She looked at hers. Outside, the work went on and the sun went higher and the morning did what mornings do, move forward, regardless, indifferent to the weight of what was carried in the kitchen below it. She thought, "I should have come sooner." She thought, "I didn't know how." She thought, "That's not enough of an excuse." She thought, "You're here now." And she was. She was here now. In her mother's kitchen, with her father's cat winding around the table legs, and her mother's skillet cooling on the stove, and 20-some strangers eating eggs on the porch, and the north field dark and planted, and the fence straight and true, and whatever was going to happen next still out ahead of them, unknown. She got up and began clearing the plates. Carol stayed. She told Greg she'd be there through the weekend, at minimum. He said okay. She told her assistant she was working remote through next week. Her assistant, who had worked with Carol for 7 years and had never once known her to take unscheduled leave, replied with a single word, "Okay." That single word probably contained more unasked questions than a full paragraph would have, but Carol was grateful for the restraint. She moved into her childhood bedroom. The room was small and exactly as her mother had left it, curtains washed, and pressed a quilt on the bed that Carol remembered from high school, a small oval mirror on the dresser that had a crack along one edge that had been there for decades. Her mother had made a point of keeping the guest rooms ready. "We don't know when people will need a place," she used to say. "Doesn't cost anything to be prepared." Carol put her bag in the corner and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room. Everything in it was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when they've been waiting. She spent Sunday helping her father with the morning routine. Fed the chickens, swept the porch, checked the water level in the barn trough, though there were no animals that needed it anymore, habit preserving the gesture. She watched Walter move through his 4:45 sequence with the practiced slowness of age, each step deliberate, each action exactly where it had always been in the order of things. He was slower than he'd been in November. She registered it now, the way she hadn't registered it at Thanksgiving, when she had been too wrapped in the effort of being cheerful and managing the visit to see what was actually in front of her. She said nothing about it. She just moved alongside him, did what needed doing without making a production of it, learned the current shape of the farm's morning, the way you learn a piece of music by sitting next to someone who already knows it. On Sunday afternoon, she sat at the kitchen table with the foreclosure notice and her laptop and her phone, and she spent 4 hours on the phone with the county agriculture office, the State Farm Assistance Program, a legal aid organization that handled rural property cases, and a bank in Billings that was not the bank that held the loan. She gathered information with the systematic efficiency that was, she supposed, the one quality she'd inherited equally from both parents: Margaret's organizational instincts and Walter's refusal to accept a situation without fully mapping its dimensions first. The situation was not good, but it was not impossible. That was the most useful thing she could say about it. The $68,000 was real, and the timeline was real, and the options were limited. But there were options. She wrote them down in a column on a legal pad and did not show the list to Walter. Not yet. That night, she went upstairs and stood outside the door to her parents' bedroom, her father's bedroom now. She stood there for a moment and then knocked once. His voice from inside, "Come in." He was sitting on the edge of the bed in his pajamas, in his undershirt, the reading lamp on beside him, a book open on his knee that she could tell from his expression he hadn't been reading. The room smelled of him, clean and familiar, the particular smell of a person you've known your whole life and of something else older. The ghost of her mother's face cream, that still lived in the vanity, probably always would. On the nightstand beside the lamp, and a glass of water, and the book, there was a watch. Carol looked at it, small and plain military issue with a dark canvas strap. It had been replaced at some point, the original having worn through. The crystal was scratched. The face was still clear. The hands had stopped. She moved to the nightstand and picked it up carefully. It was lighter than she expected. She turned it over. On the back, in small, stamped letters, C.P.L.D., Harmon. She looked at her father. He looked at the window. She said, "When did you stop winding it?" He said, "About a year ago." He paused. Seemed right to let it stop. She held the watch in both hands. She thought about the Saturday mornings when Danny used to clatter down the stairs late, always late, pulling his jacket on, telling their mother he'd eat breakfast in the truck, and Margaret calling after him that breakfast in the truck was not breakfast, it was a snack with poor posture. She thought about the last time she'd seen him at Christmas 2008, and how he'd hugged her at the door when she left and said, "See you in April." He'd meant it as a certainty. He was 24. At 24, the future still looked certain. She set the watch back on the nightstand, very gently, exactly where it had been. She said, "I didn't know you kept it there." He said, "I didn't tell you." She said, "Why?" He thought about it. He said, "Because if I told you, we'd have to talk about him. And I didn't know how to talk about him without breaking something I needed to keep together." She looked at her father, at the deep lines of his face in the lamplight, at the hands folded on his knee, unsteady but still always still, when he made them be. She said, "Duke's brother was with him. I know that now." She said, "Does it help knowing that pause?" He said, "It helps that someone else carries it, even a little." She sat down in the chair across from the bed, the one where Margaret used to sit to put on her shoes. She said, "I carry it too, Dad." He looked at her, the gray-green eyes. He said, "I know, sweetheart." It was the first time he'd called her that in years, maybe a decade. She wasn't sure. The word landed in the room and neither of them moved. She said, "We should have talked about him more." He said, "Yes." She said, "We should have talked about a lot of things more." He said, "Yes." He reached over and turned off the reading lamp, and the room went to the gray dark of a Montana night, the window holding a faint silver light from the moon. He said, "Go to sleep, Carol." She said, "Good night, Dad." She went to her room. She lay on the quilt in the dark and didn't sleep for a long time. And when she finally did, it was the deep sleep of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long distance and has finally briefly set it down. The second weekend came. Saturday morning brought the engines at 7 o'clock, the same 22, the same formation, the same unhurried disembarkation in the driveway. Carol was on the porch with 2 cups of coffee when Duke walked up the path. She handed him one. He took it, looked at her. She said, "I have a question for you." He waited. She said, "The first 3 weeks before I got here, were you planning to tell my father about Garrett? Or was that going to stay private?" Duke drank his coffee, looked at the north field where the green was already showing faint and thin, but there the first tips of whatever had been planted coming up through the dark soil. He said, "I didn't know what I was going to do. I'd been sitting on it for 15 years. She said, "What changed?" He said, "When he made us breakfast that first morning." He looked at his cup. "I'd driven past this farm before. I told myself I was paying a kind of respect, just acknowledging the place where Garrett's friend had come from. But I never stopped, never knocked on the door, never had anything to say." He paused. He said, "That morning when the light came on in the barn and that old man walked in and looked at 6 men sleeping in his hay and didn't reach for a phone, didn't get angry, just stood there and thought about it and went back to his kitchen. Something about that." He looked at the field. He said, "My brother was that kind of person. Quick to help, slow to fear. He would have done the same thing that man did." Carol said, "So you came back." Duke said, "So we came back." She thought about that for a moment. She said, "How much did it cost? The fence posts, the roofing materials, the seed?" He said, "Don't worry about that." She said, "I'm asking." Long pause. He said, "Between everything, maybe $800–900. But the labor was the thing. We've got guys who do roofing, guys who do fence work, guys who were raised on farms. It wasn't charity. It was an application of skills we already had." She said, "I want to contribute." He said, "You already are." He looked toward the kitchen window, where through the glass they could see Walter at the table with his coffee and his cat. You came here. That matters to him whether he knows how to say it or not. Carol looked at her father through the kitchen window. The back of his head, the slight curve of his shoulders, the stillness of him. She said, I should have come sooner. Duke said, yeah, well. He glanced at her. You're here now. She looked at him. He turned and walked toward the field without elaborating. That afternoon, while the bikers worked on the barn repairs, Carol drove into Billings. She did three things. She went to the county records office and made copies of the farm's title documents. She went to a hardware store and bought a new mailbox because the replacement one was already starting to lean. And she stopped at the florist near the courthouse and stood for a while in front of a display of spring flowers. And then she bought a small bunch of whatever was yellow because yellow had been Margaret's color, and she brought them back to the farm and put them in a glass on the kitchen table. Walter looked at them when he came in for dinner. He didn't say anything. He looked at them for about 4 seconds and then sat down. He said, your mother used to do that. Carol said, I know. He said she'd find them along the road mostly. Wildflowers. She didn't see any reason to buy them when they were right there. Carol said, I didn't find any along the road. He said, no, it's too early yet. Give it another month. He looked at the flowers again. The cat jumped up to investigate them, and he pushed it gently away without looking. He said, she would have liked this week. Carol looked at him. This week, he said all of it. He waved a hand vaguely toward the window. The people, the noise, the cooking, the mess of it. She liked when things were full. When the farm was all the way going 40 cattle hands, coming and going, she was at her best. She needed people around her to function at full power. He paused. He said, I'm more like Danny in that way. I can run quiet for a long time. Carol said maybe too long. He said maybe. They ate dinner in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. The trouble started the following morning. Carol was in the kitchen at 8 when she heard tires on the gravel. She looked out the window and saw 3 pickup trucks pulling into the driveway. Not the bikers' trucks, different vehicles. She recognized one of them, a green Ford with a dent in the front passenger door. It belonged to a man named Dale Foster, who ran the grain co-op and had known her father since before she was born. She went to the front door. Walter had already come out of the barn and was standing in the yard. There were 6 men climbing out of the trucks, business owners, farmers. She recognized most of them. Men who had been part of the fabric of this county for as long as she could remember. Men who had stood at her mother's graveside. Men who had brought casseroles in those first weeks and then stopped coming. She had been 12 when she first understood how the world worked like that, how crisis brought people together, and then time pulled them apart, and she had never quite forgiven it. She stood in the doorway. Walter stood in the yard. Dale Foster was the one who spoke. He was a big man going heavier with age, a careful face, a man who chose his words slowly and didn't often choose wrong ones. Walt, we need to have a conversation, Walter said. About what? Dale looked at the barn where the sound of work was still coming. He looked at the motorcycles parked along the fence, the tools laid out near the barn door, the general evidence of 20-some people who'd been working on this property for 3 weekends running. He said, people are talking. Walter said, people always talk. Dale said, they're worried about you. Walter said, nobody was worried about me for 3 years. Dale's jaw tightened. He said, Walt, I know you're angry. Walter said, I'm not angry. I'm tired. He looked at the line of men. I'm tired of people being worried about me now when they couldn't be bothered to come out here when I was doing bad. When my roof was leaking and my fence was down and I couldn't keep the tractor running. He paused. Were any of you here then silence? The specific silence of men who know the answer and don't like it. Carol watched from the doorway. She saw the bikers beginning to drift from the barn, noticing the trucks not approaching just aware. Duke was among them. He stood back, arms loose at his sides, and watched. Dale said, we should have done better. Walt, I know that. Walter said yes. Dale said, but these men, he lowered his voice, though not enough that Carol couldn't hear. These are Hell's Angels. This is a criminal organization. We have no idea what they want from you or what they're after. Walter looked at Dale. He said, they fixed my fence. They fixed my roof. They planted 40 acres. He paused. What do you think they're after? Dale looked at his boots. Duke stepped forward then. Not aggressive, just present. He stopped 10 feet from the group and looked at each of the men in turn and unhurried, giving each one his full attention, and something about the thoroughness of it made the men shift. Duke said, You want to tell me what you think is happening here? Dale looked at him. We don't know what's happening here. That's the issue. Duke said, what do you see when you look at this farm? Dale looked at the fence, the roof, the field. He said, I see it's in better shape than it's been in a while. Duke said, yeah. Dale said, that doesn't mean we know your intentions. Duke said, I don't have intentions. He said it evenly. An old man made us breakfast when he didn't have to. We came back. That's the whole story. He looked at the group. He said, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think before you answer. He looked at each man in turn. When did any of you last come out here? Not drive past. Come out, knock on the door, sit down with him. Nobody answered. Carol stepped off the porch. She walked across the yard and stood next to her father. She looked at Dale Foster and she said, I live in Denver. I called every Sunday. I thought he was fine because he told me he was fine. She paused. I should have come more often. That's on me. But the foreclosure notice is 2 months old and I didn't know about it until 4 days ago. She looked at the line of men. How many of you knew silence? She said, how many of you drove past this farm in the last year and saw the fence down and the roof in pieces and thought I should stop by? More silence. And in the silence, the shame was visible, the way shame is visible in the face of a decent person who has not done a bad thing deliberately, but has done it nonetheless. One of the men, younger than the others, maybe 40, said quietly, we should have done more. Carol said, yes, we all should have done more. She looked at Duke. And then some people showed up and did something. She paused. I'm not sure how we're the ones with the problem here. Dale looked at his hands. He said after a while, if he needs money, there are community resources. There are people in this town who, Walter said, the bank sent a notice in February. Dale, where were the community resources then? Nobody had an answer for that, not a good one. The men got back in their trucks. They left one by one and the sound of their engines faded down Route 9. And Duke walked back to the barn without comment, and Walter stood in the yard for a moment looking after the trucks. Carol stood next to him. She said, that was hard. He said, I've known Dale Foster for 50 years. She said, I know. He said, he's a good man. She said, I know that too. He said, he stopped. He forgot. She looked at her father. The word landed differently than it might have. He said, people forget. They don't mean to. They just do. She said, is that supposed to make it better? He thought about it. He said, it makes it make sense. That's not the same as better. That evening, Carol sat on the porch with her phone and called Greg. She told him about the confrontation with the local men, about Duke's question, about the silence that had answered it. Greg said, how's your dad doing with all of it? She said, better than I expected. Worse than he's letting on probably, but better. Greg said, and you? She said, I don't know yet. She looked out at the north field, dark now, the first green already invisible in the evening. I keep thinking about the timeline. 3 years. He was alone out here for 3 years and I called every Sunday for 11 minutes. Greg said, Carol. She said, don't tell me it's not my fault. He said I wasn't going to. I was going to say, you're here now. She was quiet. He said, that counts. She said, Duke said the same thing. Greg said, then maybe it's true. She went to bed early that night. She lay in the dark and thought about her mother in a red coat at a diner counter, finding a young man who needed a warm meal and help, and doing the small, simple thing without expecting anything to come of it. Not knowing anything would come of it. Just doing what seemed right because it seemed right. She thought about Walter walking into a barn at 2 a.m. and finding 6 strangers in his hay and deciding to make eggs. Not because he was looking for connection. Not because he understood what he was setting in motion. Just because there were hungry people and he had eggs and that was the decision in front of him. She thought about the small decisions, the ones that seem like nothing, the ones that turn out to be everything. On Tuesday of that week, something shifted. The Saturday after the confrontation, 30 motorcycles came down Route 9. 3 additional from a Chapter 2 counties north. Apparently word had traveled internally. Duke said nothing about the new additions. They simply arrived and were incorporated into the work as if they'd always been there. They were finishing the barn that day, the south wall, which had needed new boards for years, the wood having rotted at the base from a drainage problem that no one had fixed. 2 bikers spent the entire morning on the drainage problem alone before the lumber work could even begin. At noon, Roach came to the back door and knocked the way he always knocked, 3 times firm. Carol stepped out onto the back step with him. The morning was warm, the brightest day since she'd arrived. The mountains on the western horizon, clear and snow-capped and enormous. He said, "Can I talk to you for a second?" She said, "Go ahead." He said, "I've been thinking about something since last Saturday." He looked at the mountains. "When you told me about the woman at the diner." She waited. He said, "Was that his wife?" She looked at him. He looked back. His face was open the way that some faces are, without the protective layer that most adults accumulate, the thing that keeps their reactions from being fully read. She said, "We think so." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "She died." She said, 3 years ago, cancer." He looked at the mountains. He said quietly, "I thought about her over the years, more than I probably should have given. She was just a stranger who bought me breakfast." He paused. But it wasn't just breakfast. It was the specific way she did it, like it wasn't a favor. Like it was just what you did when someone needed something and you had it. Carol looked at the mountains. He said, "I want to do something for him, for your dad, something I can do specifically. Not just the barn work that's everybody, something just me." She thought about it. She said, "Can you fix a tractor?" He blinked. She said, "It's been sitting dead in the side yard for 2 years. Fuel pump issue, my dad says." He said, "I can look at it." She said, "Then look at it." He went and looked at it. He came back 40 minutes later and told her it wasn't only the fuel pump, it was also the fuel filter and a cracked fuel line. And if she could get the parts, he could have it running by end of day. She drove to an equipment dealer in Billings and bought the parts. She came back. Roach spent 4 hours on his back under the tractor with tools borrowed from Duke's saddlebag, which apparently contained a more complete toolkit than most garages. At 4:15 in the afternoon, the tractor turned over. The sound of it hit Walter where he was standing near the barn door. He turned and looked at the tractor, looked at it running, looked at the young man climbing out from underneath it, wiping his hands, looking pleased. Walter walked over. He stood in front of the running tractor. He put his hand on the hood and felt the vibration of the engine through his palm. He looked at Roach. He said, "How much do I owe you?" Roach said nothing. Walter said, "I don't take charity." Roach looked at him for a moment. He said, "It's not charity, Mr. Harmon." He paused. "It's for Margaret." Walter's expression didn't change, but something behind it changed, something deep in the architecture of the face. He said, "What did you say?" Roach told him. Straightforward. The diner in February 5 years ago, the red coat, the breakfast, the phone call for the bike repair, what she'd said at the end, what he'd thought about in the years since. Walter stood with his hand on the running tractor and listened. He did not move for the entire telling. When Roach was done, Walter was quiet for about 30 seconds. Then he took his hand off the hood. He looked at Roach. He said, "She never told me your name." Roach said she didn't know it. "I should have told her." Walter said she wouldn't have kept it anyway. He paused. She didn't keep names. She kept faces. She remembered faces her whole life, but she was terrible with names, and she knew it, and she found it funny. Roach looked at the old man. He said she had a good laugh. Walter said yes, she did. There was a long silence. The tractor ran between them, the engine steady. Walter said, "Come have dinner." That evening, standing at the stove, making more food than two people needed for a table of 20, Carol watched her father and Roach sit next to each other on the porch steps and talk. She couldn't hear what they said. She didn't need to. She could see the shape of it from the kitchen window, the old man and the young one side by side in the last of the day's light, and the nature of the conversation visible in the quality of their stillness. This was not small talk. This was something else. She thought about Margaret, about threads, about how a person who is gone can still be doing something in the world because of what they did when they were in it. She turned back to the stove and finished making dinner. The following Tuesday, Carol drove into Billings for the second time that week. She had a meeting at the bank that she hadn't told her father about. The bank was a low building on the west side of downtown Plain and functional, the kind of building that wants you to remember it as serious rather than approachable. She'd made the appointment with a loan officer named Greta Soloway, who had the careful manner of someone trained to deliver difficult news in a contained way. Carol sat across from Greta and laid out what she knew. The farm's title, which was clean. The assessed value of the land, which at current Montana agricultural rates was well above the debt. The payment history before the difficulties started, which was spotless for 40 years. The fact that the farm had no mortgage against the physical land, only against the operating loan that had ballooned during the equipment failures in the years after Margaret's illness. Greta listened carefully. She said, Ms. Harmon, the bank's position hasn't changed. The debt is $68,000 and the foreclosure process is already underway. Carol said, I understand that. I'm asking what would stop it. Greta said payment of the debt would stop it, or a renegotiated repayment agreement if there's documentable income from the farm operation going forward. Carol said, define documentable income. Greta showed her what they'd need: evidence of an operating farm, planted acreage, a business plan, however basic, proof of crops in the ground. Carol thought about 40 acres of dark soil with green tips already showing. She said, I'll have documentation to you by end of next week. She drove home thinking about numbers. Her own savings were not nothing, but they were not $68,000 either. She and Greg had a retirement account and a house and a reasonable cushion, but nothing that would cover this without significant disruption. She had run the numbers 3 times and the answer was the same each time. Not comfortable, but there were other possibilities. Things she hadn't fully explored yet. When she got back to the farm, Duke's motorcycle was the only one in the driveway. He was on the porch with Walter, and they were both looking at the north field, and the quality of their silence was the comfortable kind, 2 men who had been through something together and didn't need to narrate it. Carol came up the porch steps. She said to Duke, I have a question for you. He looked at her. She said, the foreclosure. $68,000. Is there anything I should know about how people were thinking about that? Duke looked at Walter. Walter looked at his coffee. Duke said, what do you mean? She said, I mean that a lot of work has been put into this farm over the last 3 weeks. A lot of people have been here every weekend, and nobody has mentioned the notice in the drawer. Duke was quiet. She said, I'm not asking for anything. I'm asking if there's a conversation I'm not part of. Long pause. Duke looked at the field. He said, people feel things when they do this kind of work. When they fix a fence or lay a roof, something gets in. He paused. Some of the guys have been talking. What it would mean for this to fall apart after all this. For the old man to lose the farm anyway. Carol looked at Walter. Walter was looking at the field, and his face was set in a way she couldn't read. She said, and Duke said, and nothing has been decided, but people have been talking. She nodded. She sat down in the third porch chair and looked at the field. She said the bank needs documentation of farm income. The 40 acres are planted. If the crop comes in, that's income. That could support a repayment plan. Duke said, what did they plant? She blinked. She realized she'd been looking at the green every day without asking what it was. She looked at Duke. He said winter wheat, about 32 acres of it. The other 8 are hay. He paused. I asked the guys what would work best for this kind of soil at this time of year. There's a man in our chapter, Marcus grew up on a wheat farm in Kansas. He said if we got the soil right and got it in before the last frost, we'd have a harvest window in late summer. She looked at the field. She said, you planned the crop. He said, we planned the crop. She looked at Walter. Walter was looking at the field with an expression she hadn't seen before. She tried to find a word for it. Not gratitude, not quite. Something older than gratitude. The look of a man seeing his land alive again after a long winter. A man who had spent 3 years watching things fail and was watching possibly something begin. She said, my mother would have cried. Walter said quietly, she would have, yes. She said you would have told her not to. He said I would have tried. She said it wouldn't have worked. He almost smiled. Almost. Just the edge of it at the corner of his mouth, familiar and unreachable, and then gone. That evening, Carol sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and worked for 3 hours on the farm documentation. She pulled the county's agricultural records, the soil assessment, the historical crop yield data for that section of Montana in comparable years. She built a spreadsheet. She wrote a 1-page summary that Greta Soloway could put in front of a loan committee. At 10 o'clock, she closed the laptop and sat in the kitchen quiet. She thought about what Duke had said. People have been talking. She thought about 22 people, 30 people coming every weekend, giving their labor, giving their tools, giving their materials. She'd estimated the materials alone at several $1,000s over 3 weeks. The labor, if you valued it, was an order of magnitude more. She thought about what it would mean to people who'd done that work to watch the farm go into foreclosure anyway. She understood then that the question wasn't going to be whether someone did something about the debt. The question was going to be whether she allowed it, whether Walter allowed it, whether the man who had spent 90 years operating on the principle that you did not accept charity would find a way to accept something from people who by any reasonable measure weren't offering charity. They were offering a return. He had made them eggs. That was the whole beginning of it. He had opened his kitchen at 2 in the morning and cooked for strangers because they were hungry, and he had food. He hadn't expected a return. He hadn't wanted one. But here it was arriving anyway in the form of fence posts and roofing nails and tractor parts and winter wheat, in the form of men and women giving a Saturday to a 90-year-old man they didn't know, in the form of a debt quietly growing smaller in the conversations on the drive home. She went to bed. She lay in the dark. She slept quickly, the deep sleep of someone who has been doing hard things and is learning to trust that they're the right things. 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, a silver sedan Carol didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. She was on the porch when she saw it. The man who got out was in his 40s, in dress slacks, in a button-down shirt, carrying a single piece of paper, and he walked up the driveway with the particular gait of someone delivering information they're not sure how to deliver. Walter came out of the house behind her. The man said, "I'm Tom Whitfield, Billings Valley Bank." Walter said, "I know who you are, Tom. Come up." Tom came up the steps. He held the piece of paper in both hands carefully, the way people hold things that feel significant. He said, "Walter, I have something you need to hear." Walter said, "All right." Tom said, "Yesterday morning a cashier's check arrived at the bank for $68,000, made out to settle your outstanding loan balance, account number 4471. The porch went absolutely still. Tom said, anonymous, "No name on the check, no return address, no note. The check cleared this morning. Your balance is zero. The foreclosure proceeding has been withdrawn." Walter didn't move. Carol looked at her father and watched his face do something complex and slow, the way a landscape changes when a cloud moves across the sun and then moves away again. Tom said, "I realize this is unusual. If you have questions about the legal aspects," Walter said, "do you know who sent it?" Tom said no. The bank has no obligation to investigate a voluntary payment. It's clean and it's clear. Walter looked out at the north field. Carol said, "Was it a single check?" Tom said, "Yes. One check, full amount." She looked at the field. The green was more visible now, 3 weeks of growth, the thin tips becoming something definite. She looked at the barn with its new south wall. She looked at the fence straight and certain along the property line. She looked at the tractor in the side yard, capable now, the engine rebuilt by the hands of a young man who had been carried 20 miles further down the road of his life by a woman in a red coat. She said, "Thank you for coming to tell him in person." Tom nodded. He shook Walter's hand and walked back down the driveway and drove away, and the sound of his car faded and the farm was quiet the way it always was in the afternoon. Carol looked at her father. Walter was looking at the north field. His hand was on the porch railing. She could see the slight tremor in it from where she stood. He said after a while, "I think I know who sent it." She said, "The whole chapter." He said, "That's what I think." She said, "Duke won't tell us." He said, "No." She said, "Are you going to ask?" Very long pause. He said, "No." She looked at him. He looked at the field. He said, "There's such a thing as a gift that you accept without taking it apart to see how it works. You take it apart, you ruin it." He paused. "Your mother used to say that." Carol looked at the field, the green and the dark soil and the mountains beyond it, white-tipped and certain. She said, "She was right." He said, "She usually was." They stood on the porch together. The afternoon light moved across the land the way it always had, slow and golden, indifferent and beautiful, and the farm held it the way the farm had always held it, with the patient acceptance of something that has been here a long time and intends to remain. Walter reached over without looking at her and patted her arm once, twice. Then he took his hand away and wrapped it around his coffee mug. Carol stood very still. She thought she might cry. She didn't. She said, "I should have come more often, Dad." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm going to." He said, "Good." They watched the field together. The mountains held the last of the afternoon light in their snowfields, brilliant and cold and far away, and the farm below them was green and beginning, and there was no one to see it but the two of them, and that was enough. May came in hard the way it does in Montana, a week of cold rain, followed by a week of sun so clear and complete that you had to squint to look at the mountains. The Northfield had moved from thin green tips to something definite and real. Winter wheat standing 6 inches now in the good dark soil, moving in the wind with the specific sound of growing things. The soft, continuous rushing that Carol had heard as a child and had forgotten entirely until she stood at the edge of the field one morning, and it came back to her all at once like a word she'd been trying to remember. She stood there for a long time. Behind her, the farmhouse held its new roof against the morning light. The fence ran straight and clean along the property edge. The barn was solid. The tractor sat in the side yard, capable of going anywhere it needed to go. The farm looked from the outside like a farm that was being run, like a farm that was going to be here next year and the year after that. She hadn't gone back to Denver yet. This was a fact she kept waiting to feel more conflicted about. She had a job. She had a home, a husband who missed her in the quiet way Greg missed things, not with declarations, but with the particular quality of his voice on the phone at night. She had a life in Denver that she'd spent 30 years building. But she also had this. She'd worked it out with her firm. Remote work was possible, had been possible for years. She'd just never taken advantage of it because she'd equated her physical presence at the office with her value. There, a confusion she recognized now as her father's stubbornness translated into professional life. She'd talked to Greg. He'd said, "Stay as long as you need to." He'd meant it. She knew he meant it because Greg said things he meant and didn't say things he didn't. She called it a trial, staying through May. She was not sure anymore that the trial had an end date. She realized, becoming a person who lived partly on a farm in Montana, this was not something she had planned. It was something that was happening to her the way certain things happen, not through decision exactly, but through the accumulated weight of days in a place until the place becomes part of you again. She had spent a lot of her adult life trying to be not from here, not in any deliberate or hostile way. She hadn't disowned Montana or the farm or her past. She'd just been somewhere else, and somewhere else had been her life. But something about this spring, about the combination of the foreclosure notice and the strangers in the barn and her father's hands on the coffee pot and Danny's watch on the nightstand, had tipped something inside her that she hadn't known was balanced. She was from here. She was still from here. That was not a loss. The reporter came on a Wednesday. She was young, mid-20s, short hair, a reporter's instinct for silence, which meant she knew when to stop talking and let other people fill the space. Her name was Amy Crane, and she wrote for the Billings Gazette, and she'd heard the story from, she said, about 6 different people, all of whom told it differently, but agreed on the essential shape of it. Walter had said yes this time. Carol had been surprised. She'd asked him about it the night before, and he'd thought about it for a long time and then said, "People should know." He paused. About the farm, about what these men did. He looked at his hands, about what it looks like when people do the right thing. Amy sat on the porch with a notebook and a recorder and talked to Walter for an hour. Walter talked to her the way Walter talked to anyone directly without performance, in the cadences of a man who has nothing to prove because he stopped trying to prove things a long time ago. He told her about the barn and the breakfast, about the fence, about the roof and the field. He told her about Duke and Garrett, about the connection he hadn't known existed until it was explained to him. He didn't tell her about the debt. He didn't tell her about the cashier's check. Carol noticed and didn't say anything. After the interview, Amy asked if she could speak with Duke. Walter said, "That's not my decision to make." She found Duke through the chapter's general contact information and met him at a gas station 30 miles east of Billings on a Tuesday afternoon. She told Carol about the conversation afterward, and Carol had passed it on to Walter that evening on the porch. She asked him why they'd done it. Carol said, "Why all of it?" Walter said, "What did he say?" Carol said, "He said, 'Old man made us breakfast. Nobody makes us breakfast.'" That was the whole answer. Walter was quiet. He looked at his coffee. He said, "That's very Duke." She said, "Yeah." He said, "She going to print that?" She said, "She's going to print all of it." The article ran on a Friday morning. Carol read it first on her phone at the kitchen table before Walter was up. It was good, better than good. Amy Crane had written it with a specificity that earned its emotion, describing the farm and the man and the morning with the kind of observed detail that meant she'd paid attention to the actual thing rather than the story she'd expected to find. She'd quoted Duke exactly. She'd described the fence and the field and the roof. She'd mentioned Danny briefly and carefully. She'd ended with a line that Carol read 3 times. "The farm on Route 9 is planted again this spring. The fence is straight, the roof holds." And if you drive past on a Saturday morning, you might hear from somewhere behind the tree line the sound of work being done by people who have nothing to gain from it and everything to give. Carol put the phone down. She sat for a moment. Then she got up and started the coffee and said nothing until Walter came downstairs. He read it at the table. He read slowly. He read it twice. Then he folded the paper once and set it down. He said she got it right. Carol said she did. He said people will make too much of it. She said probably. He said it was just breakfast. She said it was never just breakfast. And she looked at her father until he looked at her. Dad, it was never just that. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at his coffee. He said no, I suppose it wasn't. The article got picked up by the Associated Press by that afternoon. By Saturday, it was on 2 national network news websites, and a morning show had called. Walter said no to the morning show without deliberating. Carol relayed the message. The morning show called back. Walter said no again. The reporter sent a letter. Walter read it, folded it, put it in the junk drawer. The junk drawer was getting full again. Carol noticed. She didn't say anything about it. Some junk drawers are supposed to be full. The Saturday after the article ran, 30 motorcycles came down Route 9. But they came with something else. 3 pickup trucks from local farms, 2 minivans, a car she recognized as belonging to Dale Foster from the grain co-op, Gary Kellerman from the implement dealer in Billings, the woman who ran the diner on Main Street, 6 people from the church Carol's family had attended for 30 years, people who had known Margaret and Walter since before Carol was born. They pulled into the driveway and lined up alongside the motorcycles in a row that was longer than the driveway could properly accommodate, and people parked out on the county road and walked in, and the driveway had more vehicles on it than it had held since the cattle years. Walter stood on the porch and looked at all of them. Dale Foster came up the path first. He was carrying a bag from the hardware store. He said, Walt. Walter said, Dale. Dale said, I brought a new hinge for the barn door. The top one, it's been loose for a while. Walter said, I know it has. A silence, not hostile, not comfortable either. Something working its way through. Dale said, I'm sorry we didn't come sooner. Walter looked at him. He said, I know. He said, I should have let people help. Dale said, we should have tried harder to help. They looked at each other for a moment. 2 old men who had known each other for 50 years and had let those years do what time does, to things wear down the edges, smooth over the complications, make it easy to assume that the person you used to know was still fine without checking. Walter said, come inside, Carol will put the coffee on. What happened that Saturday was something Carol hadn't seen before and would spend a long time afterward trying to describe. The farm filled with people, not with the purposeful efficiency of the bikers, though the bikers were there too, working on the final interior repairs to the barn, and some of the local men joined them, and the woman from the diner brought a pan of cinnamon rolls, and the church people set up folding tables on the lawn and put food on them, and children Carol hadn't known existed came running across the property and chased the chickens, and the chickens, for once, seemed to enjoy it. Carol cooked in the kitchen with her father's neighbor Helen, who had lived 2 miles east on Route 9 for 40 years, and had known Margaret and had cried at the funeral and had brought 3 casseroles in the first month, and then, like everyone, had stopped coming. Helen chopped onions at the kitchen counter and talked and cried a little and talked more, and Carol listened and cooked, and the kitchen was full of steam and noise and the smell of oil on the cast iron skillet. At some point in the mid-afternoon, Carol went outside and stood on the porch and looked at the property. There were maybe 60 people on the farm, bikers and farmers and church people and neighbors moving through the space together with the particular ease that comes when everyone is focused on the same thing. She saw Duke in conversation with Dale Foster near the barn, and from the angle of their heads and the quality of their attention, it was clear they were talking about something specific, something structural, and Dale was nodding, and Duke was gesturing toward the roof overhang, and 2 men who had no obvious business knowing each other were figuring something out together. She saw Roach teaching one of the church deacon's teenage boys how to properly tighten a fence wire, and the boy was paying close attention the way teenagers pay attention when the instruction comes from someone who looks like no adult authority figure they've ever encountered. She saw her father. He was sitting in his porch chair in the middle of everything, his coffee cup in his hands, watching. Not overseeing, not directing, just watching. His face had the quality she had been seeing more of in the past weeks, open in some way, that it hadn't been in the years before. Not vulnerable, Walter didn't do vulnerable, but open, like a window that had been painted shut and someone had found the right tool and worked the frame loose, and now there was air moving through it. She sat down next to him. He said, "Did you know your mother used to dream about this?" She said, "About what?" He said, "About the farm being full of people." He looked at the yard. She used to say when the boys were young and we had the full herd and the hands coming in, she used to say, "This is what it's supposed to be. Land isn't supposed to be quiet. People are supposed to be on it." He paused. He said, "I think she would have called this," and he waved his hand at the yard, the 60 people, the tables, the motorcycles alongside the farm trucks, the teenagers learning to tighten fence wire, the cinnamon rolls, all of it. "I think she would have called this about right." Carol looked at her father's face. She said, "I think so too." He said, "I miss her." She said, "I know you do." He said, "Every day." He was quiet for a moment. "The way you miss air when it's just gone and there's nothing to fill the absence with." He paused. "These last few weeks." He looked at the yard. "There's been some air." She didn't say anything. He said, "I was in bad shape. Worse than I told you." She said, "I know." He said, "I had been thinking about things I shouldn't have been thinking about." He said it carefully, the way a man names something dangerous with precision. "I don't mean I was going to do anything. I just mean I had stopped." He paused. "I had stopped being oriented toward the future. I was just waiting." Carol looked at her father's face. She felt something move through her that had no good name. Fear after the fact. Grief that arrived too late to do anything about what caused it. She said, "And now," he looked at the field, the green of it definite now moving in the light wind. He said, "Now I want to see what the harvest looks like." She felt her eyes sting. She blinked once hard. He said, "Don't cry." She said, "I'm not." He said, "You are." She said, "Shut up." "Shut up, Dad." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She hadn't heard him laugh in so long that the sound of it shocked her, the approximation of it, the nearness. She looked at him, and he was looking at the field with something on his face that might have been the beginning of something lighter. She sat next to him and didn't say anything, and watched the farm that should have been lost, still standing around them, improbably because of a Tuesday night in the rain and a man who chose eggs over fear. The next morning was Sunday quiet, the way the farm was quiet after a full day, and Carol was in the kitchen making breakfast when she heard her father on the stairs, slower than usual, careful. He came into the kitchen and stood near the table and looked at her at the stove. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Of course." He said, "What are you going to do?" He paused. "With your life, are you going back?" She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the directness he always watched, with no softening, no performance. She thought about Denver, the architecture firm, the mixed-use development in Cherry Creek, the contractor who was behind schedule, the apartment that she and Greg had bought 12 years ago and turned into something that looked exactly like the life they'd meant to have. She thought about Greg's voice on the phone at night, steady and patient. She thought about the Sunday calls that went 11 minutes and ended the same way every time. She turned back to the stove. She said, "I've been talking to Greg about coming up more, every other weekend to start. More in summer." She paused. "And I've been talking to my firm about restructuring my role. More remote, less travel." She heard her father sit down at the table. She said, "I'm not going to move back permanently. That's not practical right now, maybe ever. But," she paused, "I've been gone too long. I've been gone in ways I didn't understand were absences." He said, "You had your life to live." She said, "So did you." She turned. "So did you, and you lived it in a way that included me. You showed up. You came to every graduation, every big thing. You drove to Denver and sat in Greg's living room and drank his bad wine and were polite about it." He said, "His wine is bad." She said, "It really is." Pause. She said, "You showed up. I'm going to show up more." He looked at his hands. He said, "Your mother would be pleased." She said, "I know." She turned back to the eggs and cooked in silence for a moment and then said, "And you're going to answer the phone when I call." He said, "I always answer." She said, "Every time, even if you think it's going to be a hard conversation, especially if you think it's going to be a hard conversation." Long pause. He said, "All right." She said, "Promise me." He said, "Carol." She said, "Promise me, Dad." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I promise." She put the plates on the table, and they sat across from each other in the morning light, just the two of them, and ate their eggs, and the kitchen was warm, and the cat wound around the table legs, and outside the north field moved in the early wind, and the farm that had been given back to them was there solid and real on the other side of the window. After breakfast, Carol went upstairs. She stood outside her father's door for a moment. Then she knocked. He said, "Come in." She opened the door. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, same as the first night, the reading lamp on. The watch was on the nightstand. She said, "Would you like to tell me about him?" He looked at her. She said, "Danny, would you tell me about him? Not the war, not the end, just him. The things you remember that I might not know." Walter looked at the watch. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Close the door. Sit down." She closed the door. She sat in the chair. And Walter Harmon, who had carried his son's memory the way he carried everything alone in silence, without asking for any help with the weight of it, opened his mouth and talked. He talked for 2 hours. He told her things she didn't know, and things she did, and things she'd forgotten, and things she'd never be able to forget again. He told her about Danny at 5 years old, convinced he could ride a horse bareback because he'd seen it in a movie, and the resulting consequence that Walter had had to sit on the fence and pretend not to laugh about. He told her about the summer Danny was 14 and they'd rebuilt an engine together in the barn, the two of them, over 4 weekends. And when it finally turned over, Danny had looked at his father with an expression of pure joy, uncomplicated and absolute, the way teenagers look before they learn to be complicated. He told her about the last conversation. Christmas 2008, how Danny had sat at the kitchen table after dinner and talked about the mountains in Kunar province, how they reminded him of Montana, but larger, more severe, like Montana had been turned up too loud. He'd said, "I'm ready to come home, Dad. After this next deployment, I'm ready." Walter stopped talking for a moment. He looked at the watch. He said, "He was ready. He just didn't make it." Carol said nothing. He said, "I kept the watch wound for 10 years. He paused. "Every Sunday morning. I wound it and set it by the radio the way he used to." He looked at her. "A year ago, I set it down and I thought he doesn't need it kept for him. He's not coming back to use it. I'd been keeping it for me." He reached over and picked up the watch. He held it for a moment. Then he held it out to Carol. She looked at it. She said, "Dad, that's yours." He said it was his, and it should be kept by someone who's going to keep going. He paused. "You keep going, Carol. You always have." She took the watch. She felt the weight of it light and certain, the scratched crystal, the stopped hands. She said, "I'll wind it." He said, "Good." She looked at it in her palm. She thought about Danny at the kitchen table talking about mountains. She thought about what it means to be ready to come home. She thought, "I'm ready to come home." Not permanently, not in the way she'd grown up in this house, but ready to come back to it more than she had been. Ready to stop treating it like a place that held only the hard things and remember that it held the full things, the complete things that it was where she had come from, and that coming from somewhere, really coming from, it was not a limitation. It was a root. She put the watch on her wrist. It hung loose. She'd need to adjust the band. She looked at her father. He looked at her wrist. He nodded once. Summer came. The wheat grew. Carol was there for most of it. She was there when Duke came by in June alone, on a Tuesday, not a Saturday, just stopping by, the way a person stops by when they've started to think of a place as somewhere they're welcome. He drank coffee on the porch with Walter and talked about his brother Garrett, and Walter talked about Danny, and it was the conversation it should have been 15 years ago, and it happened 15 years late and was still worth having. Carol stayed inside while they talked. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and worked on the farm documentation for the bank, the repayment plan Greta Soloway had requested as a formality, a projection of agricultural income going forward that Carol had built with the same systematic attention she brought to her professional work. She could hear the low rhythm of their voices on the porch, not the words, just the quality of the conversation, two men being honest with each other about something that hurt, and she thought, this is the sound of things getting better. When Duke left, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. He said, "He talks about Danny more now." She said, "I know." He said, "That's good. When a man can talk about something that hurt him, it means it's turning into something he can carry differently." She looked at him. She said, "Where did you learn that?" He said 15 years of men who came home from war and didn't talk about it. He paused. Some of them stopped talking about everything. He looked at the floor. Garrett would have been one of those, if he'd come back. She said, I'm sorry. He said, yeah. He looked up. But your dad, he's going to be okay. She said, I know. He left. She sat for a moment at the kitchen table and then went out to the porch where her father was still sitting, looking at the field. She sat down next to him. Neither of them said anything. They looked at the field together, the wheat steady in the early summer heat, real and green, and certain, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind. After a while, Walter said, he's a good man. She said, he is. He said, strange. She waited. He said, 15 years I never knew there was anyone out there who was also. He stopped. Who had the same hole? He paused. You walk around thinking you're carrying something nobody else can feel, and then you find out you're not. She said you were never the only one. He said, I know that now. She reached over and put her hand on his arm. He looked at her hand. He didn't move away. She was there when Roach came by in July with a new part for the tractor. He came alone, quieter and more personal than the Saturday group visits. He and Walter spent an afternoon in the barn together. Carol wasn't sure what they were doing and didn't ask because sometimes the things men work on in barns aren't about the work. She found out later from her father that Roach had asked Walter to tell him about the farm, about what it was like when it was running at full capacity, 40 head of cattle, the hands, the deliveries, the whole operation. Walter had talked for 2 hours straight, more than he usually talked in a week, about the mechanics and the rhythms and the daily reality of running a cattle farm in Montana in the 1970s and 80s. Roach had listened to all of it, asking real questions, the kind that showed he understood what he was hearing. Walter told Carol, he wants to farm someday. She said, Roach. He says he's been thinking about it for a while, has some money saved, thinks maybe Montana. She looked at her father. His expression was difficult to read, but she thought she recognized something in it. The specific pleasure of being useful, of having something to give that someone actually wanted. She said, you told him what he'd need to know. He said, I told him what I knew. He'll have to figure out the rest himself. She said, that's how it works. He said, yes. There was a phone call in early August that Carol thought about for a long time after. Duke called her cell. He said, something I want you to know. He paused. The debt, the $68,000. She said, you don't have to tell me. He said, I know I don't. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, it wasn't just the chapter. When the article ran and got picked up, we started getting letters at the chapter address. Checks, small amounts, from people all over the country who'd read the story. People who'd had a father like Walter. People who'd been in barns. He paused. People who just wanted to do something. She didn't say anything. He said the chapter pulled it, the initial amount and the letters and what some of the guys had put in personally. It came to $68,000 and change. He stopped. The change went to a veterans organization. Carol held the phone. He said, I wanted you to know it wasn't just us. It was a lot of people who never met him and never will. People who heard about a man who made breakfast and decided they wanted to be part of that story. She said, does he know this? Duke said, not yet. I thought you should hear it first. She said, I'll tell him. She told him that evening on the porch. She said it plainly the way Duke had said it. Walter listened. He looked at his coffee. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, all those people. She said, all those people. He said, because of eggs. She said, because of who you are, Dad. Eggs were just how it showed. He looked at the field. He said, tell Duke to tell those people. He paused. Tell them the farm is going to be all right. Tell them the crop is good. He paused again. Tell them the breakfast was worth it. She called Duke that night and passed it along. Duke listened and then said, good. That's the right answer. And she could hear in his voice that he'd been hoping Walter would say something exactly like that, had been waiting to find out what the man who had started all of this would say when he understood its full size. The right answer. Walter Harmon had been giving the right answer his whole life. Not because he calculated it, but because he was at the root of him the same thing he'd always been. A man who got up at 4:45 and fed whatever was in his care and cooked for whoever was hungry and kept going. That was the whole of it. That was the answer. She sat on the porch after the call, and looked at the dark field under the Montana stars, the enormous sky that Danny had loved from the ridge that Margaret had looked at every night of her life, that Walter still looked at every night of his, and she thought, this is the place. This is where things grow back. The harvest took 3 days in late August. Duke organized it the way he'd organized everything else without fanfare through a series of phone calls. And on the first morning, 12 people showed up with the chapter's borrowed combine, and the work began. Carol stood at the edge of the field and watched the combine move through the wheat in long, slow passes and felt something she recognized from the stories her parents used to tell about the cattle years, about what it felt like when the farm was working, when the land was doing what it was built to do. She felt like she was watching her father breathe. Walter stood beside her. He watched the combine with the focused attention he gave to everything. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "Good crop." She said, "Yes." He said Margaret would have said something about bread. She said she absolutely would have. He said something about how this is where bread starts. Looking at wheat and thinking about bread. That was very her. She said she had an extraordinary ability to see the end of a process. He said she had an extraordinary ability to see the good in things. He paused. Bread was the good at the end of wheat. They stood together and watched the harvest move through the field in long gold rows, and the mountains beyond it were blue in the late summer light, and the sky was the enormous Montana sky that doesn't apologize for its size, and the farm was alive. The check from the grain co-op came in the second week of September. Carol was there when it arrived. She carried it to the kitchen table and set it in front of her father. He looked at it. He didn't pick it up. He said how much. She said the amount. He was quiet. He said, "That's more than I've made off this land in 5 years." She said, "I know." He said, "Because of the planted acreage." She said, "Because of the planted acreage and the soil prep and the timing and the variety they chose." She paused. Duke's guy from Kansas knew what he was doing. Walter looked at the check. He said, "There's a man in this chapter. Marcus." She said, "The wheat farmer from Kansas." He said, "I'd like to thank him." She said, "I'll tell Duke." He looked at the check for another moment. Then he picked it up and put it in the drawer. Not the junk drawer, the drawer where he kept the bills that needed paying. He said, "This keeps the lights on through next year." She said, "Yes." He said, "And next spring." She said, "We'll plant next spring too, if you want." He looked at her. She looked back. He said, "I want." She said, "Then we'll plant." The fall came and went. Carol went back to Denver for 3 weeks in September and came back. She went back for Thanksgiving with Greg, who came to the farm for the first time since Margaret's death, and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the house and said quietly, "It looks like someone lives here." And Carol had understood exactly what he meant, that there was a quality of occupation now, of ongoing life, that the house had been missing. She and Walter had made Thanksgiving dinner together. Greg had been put in charge of exactly one thing, which was the rolls, and he had managed it satisfactorily and been told so, which for Walter constituted high praise. Duke came Christmas Eve. He brought his wife, a small, steady-eyed woman named Patricia, who shook Walter's hand and looked around the kitchen and said, "Your daughter tells me you're a good cook." Walter had said, "I do all right." Patricia had looked at Carol and raised her eyebrows, and Carol had said, "He's excellent," and Walter had looked at both of them and gone back to the stove. On New Year's Day, Carol sat on the porch with her father in the cold. They were in their coats with their coffee, and the mountains were clear, and the land was white with the light snow that had come on the 30th and stayed. She said, "What do you want this year?" He thought about it. He said, "I want to see the spring planting." She said, "That's a given." He said, "I want to see the summer crop." She said, "Also a given." He said, "I want to see you more than I have been." She looked at him. He said, "You've been here a lot, but I want to keep it that way." He paused. "I know that's asking something of you." She said, "It's not asking too much." He said, "I want to call Danny's unit commander." He paused. "Duke has a contact who might help me find out more about how it happened." He looked at the mountains. "I've been carrying not knowing for 15 years. I think I want to know." She held her coffee cup in both hands. She said, "I'll help you with that." He said, "I know you will." She said anything else. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the white land, the fence line clean and straight in the snow, the north field sleeping under its white cover waiting. He said, "I want to keep making breakfast on Saturdays." She looked at him. He looked at her. the ghost of that almost smile at the corner of his mouth familiar and real in hers. She said, "Then I'll keep the eggs stocked." He said, "Good." They drank their coffee in the cold. In the spring, when the planting season came back around, a convoy of motorcycles rode down Route 9 on the first warm Saturday. They came slowly, single file, unhurried. Carol was on the porch watching when they came around the bend. She counted them as they passed. 26. They didn't turn in. They moved past at the same steady pace, and as each rider passed the farm driveway, a hand came up. Just briefly. Just once. Walter was standing at the porch railing. He raised his hand. He held it there until the last motorcycle had passed and the sound of the engines had faded around the next bend, and the morning birds came back and the land was quiet again. He put his hand down. He said, "Not looking at her, good people." She said, "Yes." He said, "Strange way to find them." She said, "Maybe that's how you always find them." He considered this. He said, "Maybe." He turned and went back inside. She heard the sound of the stove, the particular click of the burner catching, and then the smell of coffee. She stayed on the porch a moment longer and looked down the county road where the motorcycles had gone, the dust settling behind them. She thought about the morning it started. A Tuesday night rain, 6 men in a barn, an old man who decided to make eggs. A thread no one had planned running from a diner counter in Billings, to a farm on Route 9 running from a woman in a red coat, to a young man on the road running from a small decision made without expectation, to a field of wheat, in a cleared debt, and a father and daughter sitting together in the cold on New Year's Day. The world is full of these threads. Most of them we never see. Most of them we never know we're part of. We just make the small decision, the ordinary one, the one that seems like nothing, and set something in motion that will never follow all the way to its end. Walter Harmon made eggs. Margaret Harmon bought breakfast. Carol Harmon drove 8 hours because a neighbor called. And Duke rode past a farm he'd been watching for 15 years, and this time this once turned in. That's the whole story. And also, it's not the story at all. The story is bigger than any of its parts. The story is something about what it costs and what it means to see another person, really see them in the moment when they need to be seen, and to offer what you have. Eggs, coffee, a fence line, 40 acres of winter wheat. Walter Harmon died in the spring of 2025 at the age of 96 in his own bed, in his own farmhouse on his own land. The foreclosure sign was long gone. The fence was standing. The north field was planted. His daughter was in the next room. At the funeral, 6 motorcycles were parked outside the church. The riders stood in the back row in clean shirts under their vests. They didn't sit with the congregation. They didn't sign the guest book. Duke was there. Roach was there. They came in and stood and were present in the way that counts, the way that doesn't require explanation. The flowers on the casket were wildflowers, yellow and white and purple, the kind that grow along Montana back roads in May without anyone planting them. The kind that come back every year because that is what they do. The card tucked into the arrangement read in plain block letters, "Thanks for breakfast." Carol read it and held her father's watch loose on her wrist. The stopped hands at exactly the moment they'd stopped, and she thought about bread and wheat and winter fields waking up, and about all the people who had stood in that kitchen and eaten what was offered, and about her mother's laugh, too big for her frame, filling up every room she ever stood in. She thought things grow back. She put her hand on the casket and kept it there for a moment. Then she straightened her shoulders and turned and walked out into the Montana spring, where the mountains were white and enormous against the blue sky, and the road ran straight and long in both directions, and somewhere down Route 9 the north field was green and moving in the early morning wind. She went home to make breakfast. Winter on the farm was a different kind of quiet than the quiet Carol had feared when she first arrived. It was not the empty quiet of a house sealed shut against the world. It was the quiet of things resting, of land under snow doing what land does in winter, holding itself in reserve, storing what it would need. She understood this now in a way she hadn't understood it from Denver, from the outside of it. You had to be here to feel the difference. She and Walter had fallen into rhythms. His 4:45 was still 4:45, and she had stopped fighting her own body's adjustment to it, the way after enough weeks, the house's schedule became your schedule, and you woke before the alarm, and lay there in the dark listening to his boots on the stairs below. She'd started going down to join him some mornings. Not every morning, but some. They would stand on the porch in the pre-dawn cold with their coffee, not talking, just watching the sky lighten over the mountains, and she found that she looked forward to it in a way that surprised her. It was not dramatic. It was not the reconciliation of decades in a single gesture. It was just two people standing in the cold together before the world started, and it turned out that was enough. It turned out that had always been enough if she had been willing to show up for it. She talked to Greg every night. He had been to the farm twice more since Thanksgiving, once in October, when the leaves were turning along the creek bed, and the property had a particular beauty that Greg, who had grown up in suburban Ohio, stood in the middle of and said nothing for a full minute, which for Greg was the highest form of praise. And once in December, a quick trip, just 4 days, and he had helped Walter fix the gate on the chicken yard, and the two of them had worked side by side in the cold, and Carol had watched from the kitchen window and thought about the years she had kept these two parts of her life separate, as if they couldn't coexist, as if the Denver life and the Montana life were incompatible, when in fact all they'd needed was someone willing to carry them in the same two hands. Greg had said to her on the drive back to the airport, "You seem different here." She said, "Different how?" He said, "Slower." He paused. "I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean you move differently, like you're not in a hurry to get to the next thing." She thought about that for a long time after he left. She had spent her adult life in a hurry to get to the next thing, the next project, the next milestone, the next level of the career she'd built, with the focused intensity of someone who had decided early that achievement was the safest thing to want, because achievement, unlike people, didn't leave. She had been good at it. She was still good at it. But she understood now, standing in the pre-dawn cold on a Montana porch, that she had confused the urgency for the purpose, had mistaken motion for direction, had been so reliably in transit that she had never fully arrived anywhere. She was arriving now. That was what Greg had seen. Roach called in November to say he'd put a deposit on 40 acres in the Judith Basin about 90 miles northeast. "Good wheat country," he said. "I talked to Marcus from the chapter. He's going to help me figure out the first season." Walter, when Carol told him, went quiet in the particular way he went quiet when something pleased him that he didn't know how to say. She said, "What?" He said, "Nothing." He paused. "He's going to be all right, that young man." She said, "Because of you." He said, "Because of your mother, originally." She said, "And then because of you." He looked at his coffee. He said, "Margaret used to say you plant things and you don't always get to see what grows." He paused. She was talking about the garden. He looked at Carol. But she was right about more than the garden. She usually was. In early February, a letter arrived addressed to Walter from a man named Colonel James Whitaker, retired, who wrote that he had been the battalion commander for Danny's unit in Kanawha Province in 2009. He said he had read the article in the Gazette and had been meaning to write for years but had not known how to begin. He wrote about Danny with the specific clarity of a man who had carried a roster of names for 15 years and remembered each one. He wrote 3 pages. He described the terrain and the mission and the particular courage that Danny had shown in the weeks before he died. And he wrote near the end that Danny Harmon had been the kind of soldier who made every man around him better by example, not by instruction, but by simply being the person he was. Walter read the letter at the kitchen table. He read it twice. He folded it carefully and held it for a moment, and then he put it in the drawer next to Danny's watch, which was on the nightstand, but sometimes came downstairs in Walter's shirt pocket when he didn't know Carol was watching. He said, "I'm going to write him back." She said, "I'll help you." He said, "No." He paused. "This one I'll do myself." She nodded. She understood. He did write back. It took him 3 drafts over 2 weeks, and he showed Carol none of them, but she found the drafts in the recycling bin later and read them when he was outside, and she stood in the kitchen holding the crumpled pages and could not speak for a while. The letter he ultimately sent was 1-page handwritten, and she knew it was the best letter he had ever written because it said what it needed to say and nothing more. And that had always been Walter's particular genius, to find the exact center of a thing and stand there. Colonel Whitaker wrote back in March. The 2 men exchanged 4 letters before the spring came. Carol did not read them. They were not hers to read. Duke called in late January to say he'd heard from Roach that the Judith Basin property had come through and the kid was already working on the soil prep. He said, "Your dad said something to him that I think changed the direction of his life." Carol said, "What did he say?" Duke said, "Something about how land isn't just something you own. It's something you're in conversation with." Roach said he'd been thinking about that phrase for weeks. She said, that sounds like him. Duke said, yeah, he paused. How's he doing? She said, better. Every week a little better. Duke said, he eating? She smiled. She said, he's eating. Duke said, good. Tell him Marcus says the wheat in the North Field was some of the cleanest grain he's seen from Montana soil. That's high praise from Marcus. She told him. Walter looked out at the snow-covered North Field for a long time after she said it. Then he said, good soil. Always was good soil. Margaret's father plowed that field for the first time in 1934. She said, you never told me that. He said, a lot of things I never told you. She said, tell me now. And he did. Over the winter, he told her things she'd never known about the farm and the family and the land stories that went back before he was born, stories his own father had told him on mornings not unlike these, standing at the edge of a field, watching the light change. He told her about the hard years and the good years and the years that were both at once the way most years are. He told her about the summer of 1987, when they'd had the best hay crop in the county, and the sense of abundance it had created, not just financial abundance, but something more like confirmation, like the land saying, yes, you are doing this right. He told her about the winter of 1993, when they'd lost 11 head to a respiratory illness, and he'd been up for 4 days straight, and Margaret had brought coffee to the barn every 4 hours without being asked. She always brought it in the blue thermos, Walter said. Not because it was better than a regular pot, just because the blue thermos was the barn thermos. It had a place and she put it in its place. He paused. She was very good at knowing the right place for things. Carol thought about the cast iron skillet on the high shelf. The right place for years had been in use. And it was in use again now every Saturday, and some weekdays too, when the occasion called for it, and the smell of it heating on the burner had become the smell of the house again. The smell that meant someone was home. She was home. She hadn't said it to Greg yet in so many words. But he knew, she could tell he knew, because he had started looking at property listings and billings on his phone in the evenings, when he thought she wasn't paying attention, not with urgency, just with the open curiosity of a man beginning to map a possible future. She hadn't said anything about it. She was waiting for the right moment, which was very unlike her, because Carol Harmon had spent her life believing that the right moment was whichever moment you were currently in. Maybe she was learning something from her father after all. She thought about this on the New Year's Day porch, sitting in the cold with her coffee, the mountains white and enormous in the clear winter air. She thought about how much she had learned in the 9 months since Darlene Sykes called at 6:47 on a Thursday morning. She had learned that her father's pride was not a wall between them, but a door that opened inward, and that you had to knock and wait rather than push. She had learned that grief held alone doubles in weight with every year, and that the sharing of it, even imperfect, even late, reduces it to something a person can actually carry. She had learned that the people you expect nothing from are sometimes the ones who give you everything, and that this is not a paradox but a principle that expectation narrows the channel through which good things can move. She had learned that her mother's red coat and a diner counter in February, and a $20 bill, and the willingness to see a young man sitting outside in the cold and decide to do something about it, had set a chain of events in motion that saved a farm and rebuilt a family and gave a young man a direction and let 2 old men grieve their brothers together 15 years after the fact. She had learned that none of this was remarkable. That was the thing. That was the whole thing. None of it was remarkable. It was just people doing the small and obvious thing when the small and obvious thing presented itself, and those small and obvious things accumulating year after year into something that looked from far enough away like grace. Her father looked at her from his chair. He said, "What are you thinking about?" She said, "Mom." He looked at the mountains. He said, "She'd be glad you're here." She said, "I know." He said, she'd also tell you that you're gripping that coffee cup too tight." Carol looked at her hands. She loosened her grip. He said, "She used to tell me the same thing." He paused. "Every single morning." She said, "Did you ever stop doing it?" He said, "Not once." She said, "Neither will I." He almost smiled. The almost smile she had been watching for 9 months, the one that never quite completed itself, but was real, was his. It was enough. More than enough. It was the thing she had driven 8 hours in a panic to find, and had found not in a single moment, but across a whole season of small mornings and long evenings and meals cooked in her mother's kitchen, with her mother's skillet and her father's coffee getting cold on the counter. She had found it. She was keeping it.